Is the Supreme Court's verdict on AMU's minority status. The Supreme Court has in fact deferred the judgment on the Aligarh Muslim University issue, saying that another bench would be constituted to decide on a 2006 order by the Allahabad High Court, which had overturned the minority status of the educational institution. It was a 4:3 judgment on AMU. The Supreme Court has now opened the door for AMU to claim that minority status. The Supreme Court, remember, has overturned the previous judgment on this issue. The 1967 judgment, Supreme Court says, had denied, the judgment had in fact denied the minority status to AMU, and the Supreme Court has now asked to constitute a new bench to decide on this particular issue. And my colleague Sunil Prabhu joins us from the Supreme Court. Sunil, just break it down for us. What does this judgment mean?
Well, this is a very historic judgment, 4:3. And I spoke to the lawyer who was actually, one of the petitioners in this case, and this is Kapil Sibal, who said this is a reference bench. So don't expect that a determination of whether Aligarh Muslim University is a minority could have been decided by the seven-judge bench. This was to determine the issue. 4 judges have determined the issue very categorically. They have, turned down the 1967 judgment. As you know, the history of the Aligarh Muslim University, and to break down to our viewers, in 1967, 5 judges bench had held very categorically that AMU was not a minority institution. Subsequently, in 1981, the Aligarh Muslim University was amended by an act of parliament, and it was made minority in character. And then, of course, later on, the Aligarh Muslim University gave reservation for minorities in 50%, especially in medical education.
All right, Sunil, I'll have to interrupt you there for just a short bit. In fact, Shadan Farasat, the lawyer, he's in fact speaking at the moment. Let's listen into what he has to say.
और वो एक छोटी जजेस की खंडपीठ डिटरमिन करेगी, लेकिन जिस तरह का टेस्ट ले डाउन किया गया है वो एमयू की हिस्ट्री और एस्टेब्लिशमेंट के हिसाब से चांसेस काफी हाई हैं कि एमयू विल बी फाउंड टू बी अ माइनॉरिटी इंस्टीट्यूशन. लास्ट क्वेश्चन एंड देन यू कैन आस्क मिस्टर भाटिया आल्सो.
क्या मानक तय किए गए हैं?
मानक तय किए गए हैं. पहली कि व्हाट वाज द हिस्ट्री ऑफ द इंस्टीट्यूशन, प्राइमरी डॉक्यूमेंट्स क्या थे उस इंस्टीट्यूशन को फॉर्मेशन में, फंड्स और कॉर्पस कहां से आए थे, और इंस्टीट्यूशन किस कम्युनिटी ने अपने आप को नर्चर करने के लिए वो इंस्टीट्यूशन एस्टैब्लिश किया था, अपनी पढ़ाई, अपनी एजुकेशन, अपने प्रोफेशनल लेवल को इंप्रूव करने के लिए वो एस्टैब्लिश किया गया था. और इन सारी चीजों को एक होलिस्टिक तरह से देखना है, एक टेक्निकल तरह से नहीं देखना है. और चाहे उसको एक्चुअल जो इनकॉर्पोरेशन है वो चाहे किसी सोसाइटी रजिस्ट्रेशन एक्ट में हुआ हो या वो चाहे किसी लेजिस्लेचर की एक्ट के थ्रू हुआ हो, वो मानने नहीं रखता है. मानने ये रखता है कि रियल इंटेंट क्या था, वो इंस्टीट्यूशन एक माइनॉरिटी को एस्टैब्लिश, माइनॉरिटी ने अपने लिए अपने आप को एजुकेशनली एडवांस करने के लिए एस्टैब्लिश किया था या नहीं.
आज की डेट में इसका स्टेटस क्या रहेगा?
आई विल द अदर क्वेश्चन यू कैन आस्क मिस्टर भाटिया. आई विल जस्ट आंसर दिस लास्ट क्वेश्चन एंड यू कैन आस्क मिस्टर भाटिया.
आज की डेट में जब 81 क्वैश हो गया,
81 क्वैश नहीं हुआ, 81 इररेलेवेंट हो गया.
करेक्ट. अजीज बादशाह क्वैश हो गया.
हाँ.
तो आज की डेट में एमयू का स्टेटस क्या है?
आज की डेट में एमयू का स्टेटस मेरे हिसाब से डी जूरे इज अप फॉर डिटर्मिनेशन, डी फैक्टो इज माइनॉरिटी.
ओके,
थैंक यू.
All right, let's go across to Sunil Prabhu, who's outside the Supreme Court. Sunil, you heard what Shadan Farasat was mentioning. He mentioned right at the very end that it basically means, that verdict basically means that this institution is de facto a minority institution. Just elaborate on what exactly he meant by that.
Yeah, so that's what exactly I've been saying for the last 1 hour, if you recall, just as the verdict came out, stopping short of giving it a minority status. And as I explained to you, Kapil Sibal, the petitioner for this case, who argued before the 7-judge bench, speaking to me immediately after the verdict was delivered, has said very categorically that this was a reference bench. All the details, as has been pointed out, all the prerequisites that are required for determining have been spelled out by this reference bench, and it's in this context we'll have to wait and see now when that bench is constituted, how they look at the AMU. So as I was giving you the history, 1967, 5-judge bench had held that AMU was not minority in character. In 1981, a subsequent act was made where it said very categorically that was a minority in status. Subsequently, there was a reservation given to the Muslim minorities, in particular, for giving postgraduate medical seats. And it's in that backdrop that the government, the Allahabad High Court had struck it. So it's on that basis now that the Supreme Court, 4:3, 3 judges dissenting, 4 of them, Chief Justice of India, in a majority judgment with his next Chief Justice who's going to succeed him, Justice Sanjeev Khanna, as well as Justice Pardiwala and Justice Manoj Mishra, have said and laid down the test of how you decide a minority status. So it's in that backdrop now that the Supreme Court has given that verdict, and it will now be a defining moment for minority institutions in particular. What was the intent? What was the character? How was AMU set up? Because there's a whole historic context right from our freedom struggle on the formation of the Aligarh Muslim University. That has to be looked at before deciding whether it is a minority status or not.
Right. Sunil, going forward, will this verdict have any effect on the autonomy of the institution now, or institutions like the Aligarh Muslim University?
No, it will have no impact at all. In fact, at present, Aligarh Muslim University is a minority institution. It will continue to be a minority institution, and that is how we will have to wait and see how things proceed.
All right. In fact, Sunil, another question that arises regarding this particular issue is, all right, we'll try and connect with Sunil Prabhu in just a short while from now. In fact, what basically this entire verdict is all about, I just have to mention that the Supreme Court's decision, it will have significant implication on AMU's autonomy and ability to provide education to the minority communities. This court's verdict, it is also going to set a precedent for other educational institutions that are seeking minority status. So that is something that the Supreme Court has kept in mind while saying that a new bench is going to decide on AMU's minority status. Remember, the AMU Act of 1920 founded the university, and subsequent amendments they were made, which had basically led to a debate on the minority status of this particular institution. Remember, in 1967, the Supreme Court ruled that the AMU, in 1967, a court ruled that AMU was not a minority institution. But 1981, amendment to the AMU Act redefined this university as an institution that was established by Muslims of India. Now, the current case before the Supreme Court, which the Supreme Court was hearing, it revolved around the university's reservation policy, as Sunil Prabhu was mentioning there, which basically allows the university to reserve 50% of the seats in postgraduate medical courses for Muslim candidates. The Allahabad High Court, remember, had struck down that policy in the early 2000s, which has led to this particular appeal in the Supreme Court. And remember, this Aligarh Muslim University's minority status, it has been a contentious issue for quite some time. And the Supreme Court, it is set to deliver, it is now set to deliver, a fresh bench is now set to deliver that verdict that is going to be constituted later. The university's status as a minority institution, it had been challenged. What the court said, what the top court has said, that it overturned that 1967, that particular judgment, 1967 judgment by the Allahabad High Court. It, remember, had denied that minority status to AMU, and that particular judgment, that has been overturned by the Supreme Court now. In fact, many have been arguing that it doesn't meet the criteria due to its establishment and governance by a parliamentary stature, to which the Supreme Court has clearly mentioned that it had basically said that the AMU, the university, it isn't defined by the fact that it has been governed by non-Muslim entities in this particular case as well. All right, I'm currently joined by Alok Srivastava, an advocate of the Supreme Court. Sir, welcome to NDTV. Just your first reaction on this particular verdict by the Supreme Court, and how do you see it in panning out in the near future now?
See, personally speaking, if you want to know my viewpoint, I am slightly against the majority decision which came out today.
Okay.
Because my view is that if there is a university which is centrally funded, there has to be uniformity, and it has to be in the mainstream. There can't be any minority status. So I go more with the Aziz Basha judgment, which was 1967 Constitutional Bench judgment. But a very important point is, which we must understand, some of the media channels ran the news that Supreme Court has declared that AMU has the minority status. This issue has been left to a three-judges bench. The three-judges bench will decide whether AMU will have minority status or not. But one thing is sure, that Honorable Supreme Court, by a majority decision of 4:3, has overruled this Aziz Basha judgment. And the Supreme Court has categorically said a very technical point. Supreme Court has said that if it is established by minority, that is relevant.
All right. Mr. Srivastava, we'll quickly come back to you. I'll have to interrupt you. I'm very sorry for that. We'll go back to Sunil Prabhu, who's joined by Shadan Farasat there. Sunil, please go ahead.
Thanks. I'm joined by somebody who's going to give us a good perspective. Please explain to us, and I just spoke to Mr. Kapil Sibal, who also argued for the petitioner, saying that this was a reference bench. So can you explain to them what exactly does this judgment mean, and what is it envisage?
So what this judgment does is that it is by a majority of 4:3. It says that the Aziz Basha judgment of the Supreme Court of 1967, which said that AMU is not a minority institution, it sets that judgment aside. So therefore, that finding judicial that AMU is not a minority institution is gone. To overcome that finding, in the early 80s, a parliamentary amendment was passed. So therefore, that parliamentary amendment has become irrelevant. Now the question is, on a factual basis, given the test laid down by the court itself today, on what is the indices on which a minority institution
They have also traced it back to the history and know what was the...
So the test include what is the history, who put the money in, what is who were the people involved, which community it was meant to primarily help. All those aspects are part of the test, which at least in my personal view and assessment, AMU should hopefully be able to meet. But that is a test which will be applied to the facts of AMU whenever that smaller bench sits and then makes that determination. But today I think is a big day in terms of AMU's history and legal entity and identity, because that 60s judgment of Aziz Basha was something which was a huge problem for its minority status, and that does not exist anymore.
So the big question is that the Supreme Court, the 7-judge bench, has stopped short of giving it a minority character.
That is correct, because that's a factual determination in light of the test laid down, which will be done by a smaller bench. But of course, it has moved in that direction by setting aside the judgment which had held it to be non-minority. And also the tests which have been laid down, at least it seems to me, prima facie, that hopefully whenever that adjudication is made, AMU will have a very good case of making before the court that we meet those
because the 4 judges have given the very clear guidelines.
Correct.
The big question is now, what is AMU? Does it still remain a minority status? It can that 50% reservation that had been given for Muslim postgraduates in medical.
So today the status of AMU is in effect, judicially to be decided by the smaller bench, right? That is where we de jure. But de facto, of course, in the sense that whatever was continuing, because there was a stay operating over the earlier judgment as well of the Allahabad High Court, and that position de facto continues. So you can say de facto is minority, but the actual de jure status is yet to be determined by the court, by the smaller bench, whenever that matter is heard.
Thank you so much for taking the time. Here you have a very categorical statement and understanding. If you have any more doubts, Osama, I'm ready now to clarify, because I was wanting to get him to explain to our viewers about this.